Melodic Mosaics, tracing the cultural threads in Mexican music. I can't take credit for that. That was Mr. Moore's AI generation. Way too fancy for anything that I could come up with. Music history starts out really far back with the Olmecs. The volume's storied cultural history starts here. The Olmecs have a pretty astounding claim. I'm not entirely sure if it's true, but they are one of the first, if not the first, civilization in ancient history to have recorded musics. We don't really know much about them, sadly. A lot of this cultural history, and it becomes kind of a theme throughout all of these, they kind of are lost or destroyed by various means. But a lot of what we do know is they have a lot of small woodwind-like instruments in the shape of pot-like heads. They made a lot of these large statuesque heads along the coastline, and that kept up with a lot of their instrumentations. The Olmecs got their name meaning rubber people or inhabitants of the rubber country, just because there were rubber trees in the area. Not too interesting. But we don't really know what they may have called themselves. That's just what they were called by their predecessors. These are maybe representations of what they could have looked like. They are obviously a little bit not in great condition through thousands of years of poor treatment and just standard weathering. Their predecessors, the Zapotec, they lived in a little bit of a different area. They lived in the valley of Oaxaca and were notably a little bit more into central Mexico than on the coastline where the Olmecs were. They believed to be responsible for the Teotihuacan Empire, which would grow later, much later, to influence the Mayans before being overthrown. The Zapotec, I couldn't find very much on them, sadly. They were destroyed by various influences or been taken over by the people that would come after them. They had a lot of similar woodwind-like instruments made of clay in the shape of heads or other animals, though not many of them are still around. Some in the shape of jaguars or some certain birds. They were paired with elaborate feather dances for religion. This is where a lot of religious culture starts to play in, a lot of their dance and music. This is some of what we believe Zapotec or even some Olmec instruments could have looked like. Obviously a lot of flutes. To preface, there are certain drum-like instruments or percussion instruments. They are just kind of constant throughout, so we don't really touch on them very often. The Mayans were incredibly influential and are probably the first of these that you may recognize by name. They were most popular for their expansion of the culture of Mexico and being known. They had their whole calendar and writing system, along with increasing the general population of Mexico. This is where the big boom of the Mexican and Central American area started to grow. They did not stop there, though. Their influence survives today, even though their collapse was in the 10th century, likely due to competition and overpopulation, but we really don't know why the Mayans fell apart. Music played a large role in their lives, though, that we do know, mostly in life and religion, with many of their songs and chants being there to honor the dead fallen soldiers or the gods themselves, to make prayer for rain or better weather. A lot of their musical instruments we actually have decent records of and preservations of, including the Mayan trumpet, harmony flute, various whistles and woodwind instruments that are very similar to the ones of the Olmec and Zapotec. Again, Mayan culture played very deeply into religion. So it wasn't just for show or fun, though there were a lot of instigation where it was just for celebration after a battle or for good weather. But a lot of these instruments and ceremonies almost required certain blessings or were played only in certain areas. Interestingly enough, a lot of these instruments were made from gourds, reeds, shells, antlers of animals, as brutal as that may be. The Toltecs came next, not too far after them. They claim a lot of very similar history and musical aspects. They, however, did increase the general population, and they made the hub, Tolan, by ancient standards, a very incredible city that would dwarf something like Mexico City at that point. Sadly, their civilization was very much destroyed by various nomadic tribes, famine, drought. This led a lot of their records to just be completely destroyed. A lot of record keeping does not keep well when you are dying horribly. But the Aztecs did quite like them, as much as the Aztecs are probably responsible for some of their fall. They did keep certain records. Their musical taste is very sparse of what we know of. We can make a lot of inferences about what they had, which was very similar to Mayan design, as close as they were. They, again, used a lot of wooden flute, trumpet, and horn-like instruments along with standard high percussion. Religion and celebration was a common reason for a lot of their music, as we know. These are some of what we have reference of. These might be recreations. They seem very more ornate and carved. For whatever reasons, religion, celebration. Some would tell stories in their own way, but these are probably not like direct. They were probably just recreations of what we had. The Aztec, these are probably the most well-known of the pre-colonization people. They took great inspiration from the Toltecs and Mayans, and that can be very well seen through their instruments, which a lot of these made percussion constructs, hand drums, wooden drums played with something like this, maybe, which isn't your standard percussion instrument. You just hit a big piece of wood. They were made in a lot of different styles out of wood to look like animals. Monkeys, jaguars, lizards were seen as the most common, made of wood and clay. The Zacata and Tiban Zuhero were some notable examples. They were played like hand drums, like congos or bongos, typically pretty tall. These instruments often were ceremonial or religious and would have carvings or stories kind of etched into them, a lot like hieroglyphs in a way. More instruments included hollowed turtle shells or different hollowed bone-like structures played with deer antlers, rubber sticks or tree branches. Very, very intuitive ways of using these. The existence of old string-like instruments, like a guitar almost, in a way, did seem to exist at some point, but these were not well treated by Spaniards. So a lot of what we have kind of destroyed. The Aztec did have wind-based instruments close to the flute or ocarina. and were in shapes of a lot of animals for various reasons. Early colonization, this is where we kind of get into the more European stylized version of music, as colonizers did not typically have a lot of respect for the people's music instruments or records, so a lot of it just gets kind of taken over from what Spanish music at that time was. It was very European style, violins, flutes, pianos, guitars, among other various string and percussion instruments. Significance of music brought over was mostly for entertainment. Most Spaniards just liked music and wanted to bring a part of their own culture overseas, but a lot of these were played in certain religious contexts, like in churches that they would later build. Catholic influence, Spain being very Catholic, would bring a lot of that in their musical interests over into their Mexican and Central American territories. These would come over in ways like Gregorian chants, or just simply more Catholic-esque music. The Spanish influence would take a lot of influence from Spain, obviously. Spain, Italy, and France. They would gain a lot of their music from them and Germany and their own classical music through time. They had great influence in religion, obviously. But this kind of meant that a lot of the documents and instruments that we had of Native Americans was either destroyed or not really well taken care of. These are very poorly rendered images of what a lot of the instruments brought over would be like. A lot of horns and violins or guitar-like instruments. The Second Mexican Empire would expand upon these kind of musics. They would implement a lot of German, Czech, and Polish military aspects into their music, like marching type music, as they would bring over different military commanders to try to bolster their own military at the time, since they were now semi-independent from Spain. Corrido was a form of this music made in the mid to late 1800s and used as a form of ballad, kind of a marching ballad that they would use to honor their former dead and just the former members of the Mexican Empire. The traditional folk music, more traditionally and recognizably mariachi, of course, the big bands of well-dressed folks using various of different instruments, violins, trumpets, guitars, accordions. These would be very popular and very recognizable. Though in the southern regions of Mexico, son jarocho is a popular subgenre of this music using a lot of African influence, combining the Caribbean styles of music, a lot of string-like instruments, harps, guitars, and a lot of hand drums. Modern Mexican music kind of dips into what we know more of today. Modern Mexican pop rock, the same way that American did, they were a lot of rebellion to very standard, the values of the older generations. A lot of rebellion to modern war, the Cold War would influence this quite a bit. Anti-capitalist sentiment would gain more popularity around the 80s and 90s. They would do a lot of covers of people like Elvis Presley and Frank Sinatra, some of the more popular ones. They would, a lot of American influence in their punk and electronic music, a lot of Eurobeat and a lot of funky European music would take great influence, which would lead to ska, featuring large orchestras, covering many old Caribbean and Jamaican music in a more modern light. This is what we may know of more mariachi style, more modern styles of Mexican dance and culture, usually just for fun and entertainment. Modern pop and hip hop comes from crossing the metaphorical language barrier. We as Americans don't get very many of them, but the most popular, some of what you may recognize, people like Bad Bunny, Daddy Yankee, Louis Fonsi, J Balvin, Nicki Minaj to an extent, Cardi B, people like that that came over in waves very recently just because of how popular they are, even in the modern pop, like top 100s. There is a lot more. Thousands of artists thrive in the underground of Mexican music, just like American music. And that's pretty much it. Anyways.